Hello. Um, Hello everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight for Assembly Online. You can see in the chat that Anne Follows has said hello from Suffolk. See 16 people tuned in. Let us know who you are and where you're tuned in from, if you like. It's always nice to see who's on the chat and see who's watching us back, because from us it's just numbers. It'll take a while for that to come through to you. There's a little bit of a delay, but when it does, then it's always nice to see. Thank you for tuning in tonight. This is Assembly Online, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Assembly Online is a free program of visual art, sound, poetry, and performance that happens every 2 weeks here on YouTube. It's been happening since April 2020, and we'll be going on to the end of April 2021 until then. We'll have a short break. Might come back afterwards to see how things are really. Tonight is we have Sarah Lowndes joining us again for a talk, Perforated, Coastal, Ruined, Neo-Pastoral, the Lure of Peripheral Places, which she will tell you more about shortly. Just saying in the chat, hi Henry and Sarah, good to see you again from Caroline Fisher. Tessa saying hello. Helen Wells, hello, here in Norwich. And Melanie and Holly also, hello both from Holly. Thank you for tuning in. As some of you may have heard before, I'm just going to read out Sarah's bio, so it gives her a bit of a more chance to talk about her own practice and her own project and the talk for this evening. Hello also Richard, watching from Glasgow. Sarah Lowndes is a writer, curator and lecturer, a research fellow at Norwich University of the Arts, and contributes to the Sainsbury Centre public programme, works with the education team at Tide and Tide Museum in Great Yarmouth. Sarah established Kunsthalle Cromer in 2017 to enhance the cultural provisions available in Cromer, and has since hosted visual arts, music, literature, cinema and performance events. She's recently been co-editing a publication with Nell Croose at CVA called Sight Writing, working with local writers to curate an alternative catalogue to the Robert and Lisa Sainsbury collection. I'm going to pass over to Sarah now. Luke Fowler also saying hello, Sarah. I'll be back at the end for a little bit more waffle and to let you know what we've got coming up. I think you should be on now, Sarah.
Yeah.
Okay, just going to stop.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you to Henry Jackson Newcomb and to Assembly House Norwich for the invitation to speak tonight on the subject of 4 places we could describe as perforated, coastal, ruined and neo-pastoral, respectively Leipzig, Hastings, Detroit and East Anglia. So I wanted to start tonight by saying something about the subtitle of tonight's talk, The Lure of Peripheral Places. The inverted commas in the title were meant to signal something problematic with the idea of peripheries, which I'll begin to unpick by talking about a couple of questions I was asked in a 2018 interview about my work as a curator since moving to East Anglia in 2015. I was asked, what are some of the positives and negatives of working outside of London / in the regions? Do you feel your work and the organisations you work with are viewed secondary to those happening in London / larger cities? I replied, viewed secondary by whom? This reminds me a bit of an alleged weather report from the 1930s, which stated due to heavy fog, the continent has been cut off from England. I'm certainly aware of the fact that the majority of English arts funding and media coverage of the arts tends to be London-centric. However, that doesn't mean that I view London as the most interesting place in Britain. I've always been much more interested in marginalised cultural practices and in so-called peripheral places such as Glasgow and now East Anglia. I've only ever worked outside of London, mostly in Glasgow, Scotland, where I lived between 1993 and 2015, and now near Norwich, East Anglia, where I moved in 2015. I don't actually think of those places as being in the regions, though. In 2017, I attended a talk by the poet Simon Armitage, in which a man in the audience who spoke with pronounced RP tones asked Armitage a question about his West Yorkshire accent. Armitage replied, "I don't have an accent, you've got an accent." I enjoyed Armitage's flipping of the perception of what is central, unaccented, dominant. Raymond Williams observed in his famous 1973 book, The Country and the City, the country and the city are not separate, but they're parts of an interacting system. The country and the city are part of a single story, of which we still have a few chapters to write. In this talk, I'll consider how we might harness the most life-affirming qualities of both to write more productive chapters of our continuing story. Since the mid-1990s, the rise of digital and internet technology and globalized culture has informed both the changing interrelations of the country and the city and the shifting relationship between centres and peripheries, and led to the phenomenon of translocality. The way in which the traditional office has been configured in recent years, as reconfigured as mobile phones and internet technologies have allowed the growth of flexi-working practices, has allowed many creative communities to flourish outside the major art centres. Contemporary peripheral creative settlements in low population density settings with affordable rents, such as the former GDR metro of Leipzig, the seaside town of Hastings, England, and post-industrial Detroit. Towns and cities with a population in the mid-size metro range of less than 1 million inhabitants and with a population density below the 3,500 per square kilometre range, like Leipzig, Hastings, and Detroit, also offer significant health benefits as compared to living in a major city, including better mental health, lower incidence of anxiety, mood disorders, and schizophrenia, higher percentage of green space, and more opportunities for being outdoors, decreased air pollution and decreased respiratory effects, greater housing satisfaction, and more active participation in community activities. However, the decision to retreat from living in a major city is not without other kinds of complications. To live in the city costs more money day to day, but living somewhere peripheral also requires investment, albeit of a different kind. This alternative investment is well described by Detroit activist and author Grace Lee Boggs, who wrote, "We need to encourage the creation of work that not only produces goods and services, but also develops skills, protects our environment, and lifts our spirits." This, she believes, can be achieved when people make the shift from being consumers to being producers, motivated by a clear sense of their own identity and purpose in this life. She explains, if we can do something for ourselves, we don't feel as powerless as the person who has to get somebody else to do it for them. The more we can do for ourselves, the more in control of our future we are. This is an idea whose time has come back as we enter the post-industrial epoch. Glasgow, where I lived previously, is a city rightly noted for its interlinked DIY art and music scenes. Yet I soon noticed the self-initiated and non-commercial approaches embraced by artists and musicians in Glasgow in relationship to their creative practices were also embedded in the self-reliant localised economies of the Norfolk countryside. For example, the numerous honesty boxes by roadside stalls where you could leave a few pence in exchange for locally produced eggs, honey, kindling, vegetables, or flowers. But besides the honesty boxes, there were also numerous farmers' markets, car boot sales, and yard sales, where bartering and discounts were the order of the day. The dominant trading practices in the countryside descend from the fair and the market, an approach that allows the fruits of local labour to remain within the neighbourhood and not be absorbed by what William Cobbett in his Rural Rights called the all-devouring wen of capitalism, comprised of the buyers and sellers who make nothing, they cause nothing to come. Today, there is noticeable resistance to the inbuilt obsolescence that characterises modern consumer culture, combined with the continuance of such allegedly outmoded practices as making your own clothes and growing your own food. The renewal of interest in the homestead model in the post-industrial period is part of this contemporary reassessment of the value and satisfaction that is implicit in producing rather than simply consuming. The expression "take your time" has an interesting double meaning in relationship to such ideas, containing a sense both of not rushing, but also of setting your own agenda. During the COVID-19 pandemic, with increased and ongoing working from home and distance learning practices, ways of rethinking our approach to life and work seem ever more important. So I'm now going to talk about Leipzig, which I described as the perforated city. The first recorded mention of the East German settlement of Leipzig was in 1015, after which time the town continued to grow as a result of an advantageous position at the intersection of two old important trade routes, the Via Imperii and the Via Regia, which respectively connected the Scandinavians with Italy and rich Westerners with the silk routes of the East. Leipzig was an important trade city from the Middle Ages onwards, and out of the three places that I selected as case studies for my book, Contemporary Artists Working Outside the City, Creative Retreat, has the longest established intellectual and creative culture. Leipzig University is the second oldest German university, founded in 1409, and the Leipzig Art Academy, now the Academy of Visual Arts, was founded in 1764. Leipzig's culture of arts and letters began to reach the world in 1481, when the city's printing industry began, with the publication of Italian Dominican monk Giovanni Nani's book on the future victory of Christians over the Saracens, Commentary on the Apocalypse. The Industrial Revolution came to Leipzig in 1823, after which time the city also became known for its steel foundries and cotton mills, and the city's population reached a peak of 713,000 in 1933. However, Leipzig's fortunes changed after the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Leipzig suffered heavy bombing raids which created a patchwork of destruction in the city's streets before the 18th of April 1945, when the city was liberated by American troops. On July 2nd, control of Leipzig was handed over to the Red Army, marking the start of the Soviet occupation of East Germany and the German Democratic Republic (GDR) era, which would last until 1989. During the GDR era, the degradation of Leipzig's historic buildings continued as the carbochemical industry located close to the city spread its polluting fumes and toxins into the city's atmosphere and rivers. In November 1989, 3 days before the fall of the Berlin Wall, East German television screened a documentary called "Is There Hope for Leipzig?", which revealed in marked contrast to the claims of the GDR regime that Saxony's largest city was in a parlous state of repair. When the Wende, or turning point, came, it brought further difficulties for Leipzig. After German reunification, the population of the city rapidly plummeted. By 1998, it was a Rust Belt city of just 337,000 inhabitants, as widespread factory closures across the city forced many to migrate elsewhere in search of service-orientated jobs. Historian Sebastian Ringel notes that shutdowns were part of everyday life in Leipzig at that time, when continuing with existing structures was more of an exception. Of 118,000 industrial jobs in the municipal area, only 20,000 were left 5 years later. By 2000, there were more than 60,000 vacant homes, and Leipzig was being described as the German Detroit. However, in 1999, the city's population gradually began to grow again, as the city started to prove particularly attractive to the 18 to 30 age bracket. Young people began moving back to the city to study, work, and take advantage of Leipzig's lower rents and living costs. Today, Leipzig's population stands at 570,000, and the number of residents continues to steadily climb. In recent years, Leipzig has been cited often as an interesting creative settlement for young artists driven out of an increasingly expensive and crowded Berlin. An article that appeared in The Guardian entitled, "Is Leipzig the New Berlin?" detailed how the city's former metal foundries and cotton mills had been requisitioned by artists, adding, "The city's thriving creative scene, green spaces, and quality of living have earned the place the nickname Leipzig." Leipzig has been well known as an artistic centre once more, a scene that's been fueled by the imaginative repurposing of the city's abandoned and empty spaces, such as the Spinnerei, a former cotton spinning mill that was once the largest cotton mill on the continent and since the mid-1990s has operated as a studio complex that today supports the work of numerous galleries and 120 artists. In 2010, the urban theorist Daniel Florentine authored a paper in which he put forward an interpretive model for the urban shrinkage management implemented in Leipzig called the Perforated City, which suggested that the approach that had been implemented in Leipzig had been carried out partly by design and partly by accident. The approach nonetheless allowed Leipzig to become a perforated city with green spaces, open spaces, and the preservation of historic buildings, including maintaining the medieval street plan in the city centre. Certainly, approximately a third of the city's landscape is parks and gardens, the largest being the riverside woods of Auenwald, 22 square miles of fields and floodplain forest, which lies mostly within the city's limits. The reason for the abundance of green space in Leipzig is connected to the city's lengthy period of decline. The parks could continue to flourish in such sizable dimensions because the city did not grow after 1930. With 15,600 of the city's historic buildings protected by law, Leipzig has also retained a significant degree of characterful and significant architecture, even while it bears the dubious honour of being the German city with the most demolished cultural icons, most of which were lost during the city's period of declining population. This combination of practices of preservation and demolition counts both for the combination of medieval density in the city centre, where narrow arcades and passageways link to wider streets and squares, and the yawning gaps where buildings were destroyed by bombing raids, demolition crews, or by simple neglect. After the long-distance railway first arrived in Leipzig in 1839, the city became a noted centre of the European rail network. Leipzig's Hauptbahnhof, completed in 1915, is the largest terminal station in Europe and was described by the railroad pioneer Friedrich List as the heart chamber of German railroad traffic. But if the railways had driven the 20th century industrial expansion of Leipzig, in the 21st century, the city's heart chamber would be the 100-year-old cotton spinning factory, once known as Leipziger Baumwoll Spinnerei, that was rechristened simply Spinnerei and gradually transformed from hulking factory to creative space. In the 1990s, the Leipziger Baumwoll Spinnerei's last production line finally closed down, and the Cologne-based owner began looking for a buyer for the site, an opportunity which Florian Buss, Tilman Sauer-Morhardt, and Bertram Schulz seized. The trio bought the property in July 2001, inspired by the do something principle of New York urban development, and they remembered. This was a decision based largely on intuition. After all, the bottom had already dropped out of the overheated property market of the post-reunification period. Although we could not expect any added value in economic terms, we sensed that the Spinnerei had tremendous potential. Every bank we asked to finance the enterprise, however, turned us down as soon as we mentioned the words huge old factory, artists, and East Germany. No one wanted to put the money up for what they saw as a pile of bricks. Instead, we concentrated on the wonderful resources we already had, an authentic factory city, largely in the state it had been from 1884 to 1907, with workers' homes along Thüringer Strasse, a factory, kindergarten, and an allotment site between the Spinnerei Strasse and the Karlheim Canal. In 2001, there were 60 tenancies in total. 30 of these were held by artists and the others by craftspeople, engineers, the occupants of the original law space, the generator custom-built bicycle workshop, and the Kunstroom B2. By the summer of 2004, well-known Leipzig artists such as Neo Rausch and Rosa Loy were Spinnerei studio residents, and influential local gallerist Gerd Harry Judy Liebke signed a lease to open a new iteration of his gallery Egan Plus Art in the complex's steam engine hall, where he would continue to promote the work of the new Leipzig school on the global art stage. Other galleries followed Liebke's lead and took on spaces at Spinnerei, including Jochen Hempel's gallery Doggenhaus, Aspen, Mayer's gallery, and the artist-run gallery Kunstroom B2. On the 1st of May 2005, the galleries officially opened their new spaces with an open weekend that attracted over 10,000 visitors. When I visited Leipzig, I stayed in a hotel close to the university within walking distance of various museums and the famous market square where traders had congregated to sell their wares since the 13th century. I visited the Museum of Contemporary History, which opened in 1999 to illustrate the history of dictatorship and resistance in the Soviet occupation zone and the former East Germany, with displays of relics from the time of the Stasi, state security police, and video footage of East Germans escaping over the Berlin Wall to the comparative freedom of the West in 1989. I also visited the Museum of Fine Arts, known locally as the Kunstbunker, designed by Berlin architects Humphnagel, Putz, Raffelian in 2004 to house Leipzig's important civic collection of paintings, which was built largely from donations from wealthy benefactors, including silk merchant Adolf Heinrich Schletter and wool merchant Maximilian Speck von Sternberg, and includes work ranging in date from the late Middle Ages to the contemporary canvases of new school Leipzig artists such as Neo Rausch. While in Leipzig, I also visited the Nikolai Church, founded in 1165, the oldest church in the city, which was the centre of the Peace Prayers protest movement that began in 1989, and which were often followed by candlelit demonstrations in the city streets. The organisers recalled, from the 8th of May 1989, the driveways to the church were blocked by the police. Later, the driveways and motorway exits were subject to large-scale checks or even closed during the Prayers for Peace period. The state authorities exerted greater pressure on us to cancel the peace prayers, or at least to transfer them to the city limits. Monday after Monday, there were arrests or temporary detentions in connection with the peace prayers. Even so, the number of visitors flocking to the church continued to grow to a point where the 2,000 seats were no longer sufficient. Then came the all-deciding 9th of October 1989. What a day it was. On the 9th of October 1989, the candlelit peace demonstrations reached their peak when a mass of 70,000 people took to the streets, an event which led to the capitulation of the GDR leadership and became known as the Peaceful Revolution. Today, Leipzig is still often referred to as the City of Heroes in reference to the non-violent uprising of 1989. I walked the length of Leipzig, passing through numerous green spaces, along avenues lined with independent shops and the odd ruined mansion building, crossing the river and heading westward towards the districts of Plagwitz and Lindenau. In the 1990s, when Leipzig was still in the grip of post-Wende decline, many of the empty industrial buildings of these districts had been repurposed by squatters, activists, artists, and entrepreneurs, such as the group of volunteers who set up and ran the skateboard park and live music venue, Coney Island. However, even today, there are still many vacant lots and boarded up properties, perhaps as much as 160 acres worth across the city. These former industrial tracts occupy a surface area more than half the size of the Markkleeberg Sea. As artist Mark Hamilton, who moved from Glasgow to live in Leipzig between 2000 and 2009, astutely noted, the lack or underperformance of a property market and private real estate investment combined with a lower density of population entail some sort of dynamic in a general sense, some type of uncertainty, some unlocked windows, abandoned factories with broken windows, an ambience with different properties. Those are conditions which also connect Leipzig to other cities across recent timeframes and the processes of deindustrialization and speculative regeneration. I put it to Mark Hamilton, it seemed as though Leipzig had changed noticeably since the 2008 financial crisis, with more developers moving in and the growing perception of Leipzig as a fashionable place. I asked him, what do you consider to be the most significant recent changes in the city? He replied, I think recent changes in Leipzig are driven primarily by the city being identified as exploitable or frackable, rather than just fashionable or attractive to newer arrivals. Scaffold and building sites are definitely everywhere. It is uncanny to experience the transformations in the inner city, where dusty plazas and public housing have been replaced by maxed retail density, luxury renovations, and other programmatic shifts typical of current private or public-private investment strategies. It should also be noted that for the original or longer-term inhabitants, the current regeneration would be second wave regeneration, following on from the initial, primarily state-led post-reunification projects. I walked on, past the Westworks studios, housed in an enormous factory. The lower half of the building was covered in graffiti, including one memorable slogan, Kunst is boss. I walked further on to the Spinnereistrasse off the western end of Karl-Heinstrasse. The Spinnerei's vast complex of buildings and 50-metre high chimney loomed into view. I hurried into the cafe located at the factory gates to warm up, thinking as I did so that all three of my case study places, Leipzig, Hastings, and Detroit, had certain climatic similarities, being warm in summer and bitterly cold in winter. Did those markedly alternating seasons breed a kind of resilience in people that lived in those places, as they barbecued in summer and then withdrew to the fireside in winter? And did those very contrasting seasons provide time in the spring and summer for socializing in parks and on the beach, and time in autumn and winter that was spent indoors and was earmarked for more introspective practices of research and composition? Later that day, I walked back into the city to see the Grand Academy of Visual Arts and to visit GFZK, a museum which consists of two parts, a Gründerzeit villa rebuilt by the Dresden architect Peter Kulka, known as GFZK1, and a glass-fronted geometric building, GFZK2, which was designed by as-if architects from Berlin. The development of the GFZK2 was overseen by Barbara Steiner, who was director of the museum between 2001 and 2011, and was a key player in the repositioning of Leipzig on the international art scene. When I visited, an exhibition of contemporary art, mostly from Germany, called The Present Order, was being staged. The exhibition included works by artists associated with the Dusseldorf Art Academy, like Sigmar Polke, Rosemary Trockel, and Amy Noble, and those known for their links to Leipzig, such as the figurative painter Rosa Loy and the self-taught artist, writer, and curator Thilo Schulz. While in Leipzig, I interviewed artist, curator, and lecturer Kilian Schellbach, who was born in Leipzig in 1971 and teaches at the Academy of Visual Arts and is also a board member of Kunstverein Leipzig. I asked him, how has Leipzig changed in your lifetime? He said, I was 17 when the Iron Curtain fell in 1989. Many people left towards the west. My school class halved in size in the last years between 1985 and 1989. It was an age of increasing awareness and of checking out the amount of leeway to be able to develop freely. During that time, the authority relaxed their rules about allowing people to leave, I think to release some of the pressure of the situation. There was a strong exodus, and at the time you had the feeling you would never see any of these people again. It was difficult in some ways to remain. One of the most formulated critiques people made was that you couldn't travel. But then on the other hand, staying also meant staying close to relatives and friends who weren't able or didn't want to leave. There was also a sense that it was possible to change something here. There was a sense with the advent of glasnost and perestroika that things could become more progressive, that the possibility of change was there. I wasn't really directly involved in the movement that centred around the peace prayers offered on Mondays at Nikolai Church, but I was aware of what was happening. The ecological agenda was very strong in the city and it grew stronger. And there were several oppositional events in churches in the late 1980s where activists sought ways to address the legacy of heavy industry in Leipzig, which had left all the rivers dead and traces of pollutants like chemicals and petrol everywhere. It was also a meeting place for the critics of the system, with a strong claim for freedom of speech and free elections. I asked Killian, do you think Leipzig's a good place for artists to live and work, and can you say why? The pace of real estate development's been slower in Leipzig than in Berlin. For some reason, Leipzig was the only GDR city that was shrinking. And after 1989, the municipality had no real plan to address the shrinkage other than an initial proposal just to demolish unused buildings. That plan met with immediate resistance from the community of activists that were squatting in Konnewitz, a district in the south of the city, who were already working on developing their own culture in those disused spaces. So there was a struggle and a conflict of ideas over how to deal with the potentials of empty space in the city. However, the people that were squatting those empty buildings knew that those buildings were in public ownership and that unless they were occupied and used, they would just decay. And they put that case to the municipality. So empty space was one important aspect to establish a subculture there. The second thing was that there was a strong political awareness amongst the activist community, as in the early 90s they often had to defend themselves against brutal fascist attacks. Militant fascist groups would come in the night to attack left-wing squatting houses and cultural institutions. The police of this time didn't intervene, seemed unorganised, or acquiesced to these attacks. However, these events led to a broader sense of solidarity and to new anti-fascist forms of cultural representation. I'm going to go on now to talk about Hastings, that I'm describing as my coastal city tonight. In October 2010, Hastings hit the news when the town's famous 900-foot-long pier was engulfed by flames following a suspected arson attack. The fire destroyed 95% of the structure of the pier, which seemed destined to join the ranks of Britain's other lost piers from Abergran to Withernsea. Hastings Pier was a particularly fine example of the work of master Victorian pier builder Eugenius Birch, and it opened in 1872 as the first seaside pleasure pier with an Oriental-style pavilion. The pier was devoted to entertainment, and 24,000 visitors paid 2 shillings each to stroll along it that first week, taking in all kinds of open-air entertainments, including open-air dancing, joyriding, and a shooting range. The pier was a magical space where surprising things happened, such as self-styled Professor Davenport stunning the crowd by riding a bicycle into the sea. By 2010, the pier had already survived numerous assaults, including a fire that destroyed the pavilion in July 1917, partial demolition during World War II, running battles by mods and rockers, and drug-fueled concerts in the ballroom by the Rolling Stones, The Who, and Jimi Hendrix. At the time of the 2010 fire, the pier was already in a poor state of repair due to a combination of storm damage and years of neglect, and it had been closed to the public for 2 years. However, in April 2016, the pier was back in the news after being reconstructed through the work of Hastings Pier Charity, who'd won Heritage Lottery funding and set up a community share scheme, which attracted 3,000 shareholders and raised close to £600,000 to restore the pier. The £14.2 million reconstruction of Hastings Pier through the successful campaigning and fundraising of the local community was such an uplifting story, determined to find out more about Hastings and the people that live there. The reimagining of the pier by DRMM architects had yielded a solution that was very simple and yet profound in its effects. Rather than reconstructing a pavilion or a ballroom at the end of the pier, as might have been expected, instead the architects had decided to concentrate their efforts on rebuilding the support structure and the deck to make both as strong as possible and leave the pier itself largely empty. The experience of walking to the end of the pier gave an intoxicating feeling of space and freedom, a view completely without encumbrances. On this elegant platform rising from the enormous tumultuous sea, the skies above feel endless. As Alex de Rijk, the DRMM co-founder and architect directing the project, explained, he conceived of the reconstruction of the pier in terms of making the space socially useful. The possibilities for potential uses of this empty pier were also deliberately endless, and the space was used by the local community for a variety of uses, including concerts, film screenings, circuses, craft workshops, and illuminated cycle rides. In 2017, the pier won the prestigious Sterling Prize for Architecture, but later that same year, sadly, the Hastings Pier charity set up to manage the pier went bankrupt. In 2018, it was purchased by the controversial local businessman Abid Gulnar, who also owns Eastbourne Pier. Some Hastings residents have accused Gulnar of cheapening the listed Victorian structure with the installation of fiberglass animals and an amusement arcade. Gulnar responded saying campaigners had been rude and insulting and wanted everything for free. Hastings is, of course, most famous for being the site of the Norman landing in 1066, when Duke William of Normandy reached the south coast and erected a wooden fort on the cliff tops overlooking the sea, while his troops prepared for the now famous battle on the 14th of October. In medieval times, Hastings, as one of the Cinque Ports, was an important trading post, and in the 18th century, the town's salty seawater and bracing air began to be successfully promoted as health-giving and curative. In 1851, the arrival of the railway brought day trippers and more holiday makers to Hastings, eager to promenade along the front and visit the famous pier. But in the post-war period, the rise of affordable overseas package holidays combined with a downturn in the local fishing industry left Hastings without either industry or customers, and in a condition of slow decline, symbolised by the neglect and then incineration of the town's wonderful pier. When I first visited Hastings back in 2017, the restored pier was the first place I wanted to see. Walking downhill from the train station towards the sea and through a concrete underpass, I noticed piles of bedding folded up and left to reclaim later. And as I reached the seafront, my attention was caught by two homeless people, asleep in a concrete shelter, each underneath a vibrant foil blanket, one purple, one lime green. I walked on towards the pier, which on that freezing winter day was almost empty. In the small visitor centre, I noticed a display explaining that the journey time from London to Hastings hasn't changed significantly since the railway first arrived in Hastings in 1851. The volunteer on duty laughed and said, "Yes, that's true, but in some ways, that's a good thing. Being that bit further away from London has allowed us to remain different, to keep being who we are. If we were closer to London, like Brighton, things would have changed much more round here." In recent years, the English seaside towns of Brighton, Margate, and Hastings have all become home to increased numbers of creatives priced out of London. In the 2000s, Brighton became a very fashionable and also very expensive place to live due to the huge influx of commuters from the capital. In the last 5 years, the focus for those seeking a less costly place to live on the southeast coast has begun to shift to Margate, which has significantly gentrified in recent years, thanks in part to the 2011 opening of the Turner Contemporary and the 2015 reopening of the UK's oldest surviving amusement park, Dreamland, complete with renovated cinema and concert hall. Now, like Brighton and Margate before it, Hastings has become trumpeted as the latest artistic outpost of London, nicknamed Shoreditch-on-Sea, is fast developing a reputation as a more affordable alternative to London and Brighton. However, over the last decade, Hastings has consistently featured on the list of 20 most deprived towns in England. In 2019, it was rated 18th most deprived in the English Indices of Deprivation report, which assesses the level to which local authorities lack income, employment, education, and adequate housing, as well as the level of crime and services in the area. Hastings is not only further away from London than either Brighton or Margate, but also less well served by frequent transport links to the English capital. One train an hour leaves Hastings for London during peak times, as compared to the 4 trains per hour that depart from Brighton. Hastings also lacks good quality higher education provision. After 2016 financial review, the University of Brighton closed their newly established Hastings campus in 2019. As a consequence of these combined factors, Hastings is perhaps still considered less desirable than either Brighton or Margate for Londoners looking for a second home or to relocate. Hastings is notable for its voluntary organisations, particularly those who have protected and enhanced the public sphere and the cultural offering in the town, both through the aforementioned campaign to save Hastings to Pier and also through the ongoing work of the Old Hastings Preservation Society, which was formed in 1952 by local residents to promote the permanent preservation of buildings of beauty or historic interest and to foster an appreciation of the history of the town. Since then, the Old Hastings Preservation Society have saved many local buildings from demolition, including the town's 18th century stables, which were rescued and reborn as the Stables Theatre Trust in 1959. The Old Hastings Preservation Society also intervened to preserve the fishermen's net shops on the Stade, a distinctive cluster of 25-foot tall, black-painted wooden huts considered a symbol of Hastings' identity. The net shops have been used for centuries by local fishermen as workshops, as well as storage sheds for fishing nets, boats and sails. But during the 20th century, many were destroyed by storms and still more were cleared by the council in the 50s as part of a clearance scheme for development of the beach. However, after intervention from the Old Hastings Preservation Society, the remaining 45 net shops were saved and they are still used by local fishermen today. Further along the parade, across the road and ascended over the magnificent rising curve of Pelham Crescent, designed by Joseph Kay and described as one of the finest Regency compositions on the south coast. The centrepiece of the crescent is St Mary in the Castle Church, which closed in 1987 and was slated for demolition until once again the Old Hastings Preservation Society intervened. 10 years later, after an extensive restoration project, the building reopened as St Mary in the Castle Art Centre, which is a popular and well-used venue for concerts, screenings and workshops. The existing landscape of cultural provision in Hastings being undergoing a gradual change since the mid-2000s, partly as a result of the regeneration of the De La Warr Pavilion in neighbouring Bexhill, which opened in 2005, followed by the arrival of London's Jerwood Gallery, who opened a space in Hastings in 2012, both of which have provided high-end exhibition spaces in the region to complement other local contemporary arts activity, such as the Arts Forum and the annual Coastal Currents Art Festival. The De La Warr Pavilion, like Turner Contemporary and Margate, receives public funding and offers free admission. The restored 1930s building is popular with locals and tourists alike. However, the privately funded Jerwood Gallery met with antagonism in Hastings for a variety of reasons. The most controversial aspect of the £4 million Jerwood Gallery was its location. Despite local protests from the group Save Our Stade, SOS, the gallery was built on an area adjoining the beach known as the Stade, in the old town of Hastings, which has been used for many years as an area for day trippers to park adjacent to the net shops. This car park gave visitors easy access both to the seaside amusements, which include a miniature railway, penny arcades, crazy golf course and a boating pond, and the stalls of the local fishermen who sold fish and seafood on the Stade for centuries. Architects HAT tried to make the building blend in with the surroundings by cladding the gallery in black tiles, the same hue as the net shops. But there's something slightly unsettling about the balcony of the first floor cafe, which overlooks the beach, allowing customers to spectate on the working fishermen. The local fishermen who opposed the building of the gallery on the Stade explained, "We've already got art galleries in Hastings and no one goes to them. Why do we need another? And why has it got to go here? The coach parties used to come down here and buy our fish, and now they won't." When I visited the Jerwood Gallery, I was struck by the admission charges, £9 per adult or £4 for local residents, £20 for families from elsewhere and £8 for local families. Last year, the Jerwood Gallery in Hastings cut ties with the Jerwood Foundation amid a funding dispute, and the foundation withdrew its collection of 20th and 21st century art. The gallery was then rebranded as Hastings Contemporary, a venue for temporary exhibitions. The admission charges have also been revised. Under 16s are now admitted free, and a First Tuesday scheme has been implemented whereby on the first Tuesday of every month there's free entry for all between 4 and 8 p.m. However, in an area of such marked social deprivation, where many families on low incomes are unable to afford essentials such as a toothbrush, it still seems unlikely that local families would often be able to afford to visit. Outside the gallery, there are fishermen's huts, sheds, and boats clustered along the shoreline. I notice one low-slung hut bearing a hand-painted message: "We do not sell drugs." Across the road from Hastings Contemporary is the Fishermen's Museum on Rockenour Road, another local place of interest that exists due to the intervention of the Old Hastings Preservation Society, who saved the church from demolition and repurposed it as a museum in 1956. The Fishermen's Museum is a treasure trove of all kinds of memorabilia relating to the marine heritage of Hastings, and the artefacts on display include a giant stuffed albatross with a 12-foot wingspan and a font, which is used for this day for the baptisms of the babies of local fishermen. The museum also features photographs of Walter Slogger Hoad, the self-proclaimed Winkle King, who dressed up in a suit bestudded with silver-painted winkles and raised funds for the Hastings Winkle Club, a charitable organisation that sought to give relief and recreational opportunities to the town's disadvantaged. On Hastings seafront, you can still find a giant metal winkle on the pavement, installed to collect contributions to the Hastings Winkle Club, with the encouraging legend, "Winkle Up," inscribed above the coin slot. There are many local organisations in Hastings and neighbouring St Leonards-on-Sea which rely upon volunteers and micro-fundraising, like the Old Hastings Preservation Society and Hastings Winkle Club, as well as more recent examples set up to support cultural provision in the town, such as Art Gallery and Workshop Complex, Electro Studios in St Leonards, and the Electric Palace Cinema in Hastings. Painter Alessandro Rajo, who moved to Hastings to live and work in 2012, says, "There's a lot of artists here on the South Coast. My family and I moved here a few years ago, probably for similar reasons to many others. It's cheap compared to London for a start, but more than that, the houses are gorgeous, usually a bit dilapidated but big, full of character and with a sense of faded glamour. They're wonderful places to imagine living with great possibilities for studio space. The most important thing, and this might be why it appeals to artists, is that there's a chance of a more satisfying work-life balance." As part of my research into Hastings, I interviewed Louise Colburn, an artist curator and arts event producer who lived in St Leonards-on-Sea between 2011 and 2016. I asked her, "Do you think Hastings and St Leonards is a good area for artists, writers and musicians to live and work? What would you describe as the most interesting, most challenging aspects of the local situation?" She replied, "Yes, I do think Hastings and St Leonards in particular is a very good place for artists and creatives to live and work. It has the perfect combination of a small scale and relatively affordable accommodation, which provides the ability for an artistic community to thrive. Many artists generally work in isolation, so it's beneficial to feel part of a like-minded community. I moved over to St Leonards from Brighton and immediately started to meet and get to know well some very interesting and influential people within the art world, which I'd struggled to do in 20 years of living in Brighton. When living in Brighton, I'd always looked to London for artistic culture, but in Hastings, you got to know artists that were living, working, and even showing there too. Almost the first friendship I made was with Becky Beasley when I went to see a show that she had curated at the Electro Studios project space. She was in the space on the day I visited and welcomed us very warmly to interact with the work. The most interesting aspects of the local situation in Hastings are the simple and obvious ones about scale, community, and landscape. The challenging aspects are the social divide between the very poor, of which there are many, and the liberal elite who are much more educationally privileged. There's been a huge influx of artists, filmmakers, writers, designers, activists, and musicians into Hastings in recent years. There's more access to opportunities and an ever-growing open-minded approach to collaboration due to the breathing space available in Hastings compared to the more urban environment of a big city. To some extent, the Durwood Gallery has helped, and the decentralisation of arts funding away from London also helps. Hastings residents do have a strong sense of ownership of the town. In some part, the body of volunteers is down to the enthusiasm and characteristic of the town, but it's also down to the semi-retired art lovers who are available and willing to help run things in the community. Although Hastings is a very open-minded town with a great sense of fun, with its numerous festivals and pub-based music events, there's also a sense of closedness, and that could simply be down to a small town mentality, but in some ways it could also be the influx of out-of-towners butting up against the strong independent spirit of the town. So I'm now going to talk about Detroit, which is my example of a ruined city, inverted commas. The city that we now know as Detroit occupies the contemporary and ancestral homelands of three Native American nations of the Council of Three Fires, who through the Treaty of Detroit ceded the land now occupied by the city in 1807. The process leading to that land grab began in 1701 when Detroit was founded by French explorer Antoine de la Motte Cadillac, who established a fort and settlement on the site, with control of the town passing to the British in 1760. Between 1763 and 1766, Ottawa war chief Pontiac led Native Americans in an armed struggle against the British in the Great Lakes region due to, amongst other reasons, dissatisfaction with British policies. Pontiac's war began with an attempted siege of Fort Detroit and ended with him making peace with the British in 1766. The names of both Cadillac and Pontiac were later given to popular automobile brands developed in Detroit by General Motors, which was founded in the city in 1908 by William C. Durant and is still today the largest American automobile manufacturer and one of the world's largest automobile manufacturers. Detroit grew gradually until the 1910s, when thousands of migrant workers poured into the city to work at General Motors and at Henry Ford's Highland Park plant, founded in 1909. Ford's plant produced the world's first complex assembly line product, the Model T Ford. By 1917, when Ford opened his even more technologically advanced River Rouge plant, there were 23 automotive companies in Detroit. However, the city's reliance upon the economic monoculture of automobile production virtually ensured the city's nearly complete planned obsolescence, as experienced half a century later. In the post-1945 period, the city's population decreased through white flight to the suburbs, and by the early 1950s, 50% of the city's population had left. During the 1967 Detroit riots, the city was the site of 59 racial disturbances, which left 43 people dead. The riots then triggered even more marked white flight that gave Detroit a black majority in less than 5 years. Increasing overseas competition in the 1970s from Japanese and German automotive companies then sent the city's automobile production industry into decline. In the 1980s, the futuristic, stripped down and hard-hitting sound of Detroit techno thrived in the hinterland of the post-industrial city and reflected the city's decline as well as the advent of new and democratic technologies. The Detroit techno scene was an entirely DIY phenomenon, facilitated by newly available digital equipment, which opened up myriad possibilities for manipulating recorded sounds. From 1984 onwards, there were many bedroom producers like Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, setting up home studios in both Chicago and Detroit, equipped with 808 and 909 Roland drum machines, Korg keyboards, TB303 bassline machines, and 4-track recorders. Independent techno records labels Metroplex, Transmat, and MS all established studios in the same building on Gratoir Avenue, later dubbed Techno Boulevard, in Detroit's Eastern Market, whereas Dan Sicko noted the close proximity of their studios allowed them to learn from one another and to fine-tune their skills by remixing each other's material. Since the mid-90s, Detroit has also been the cradle of a noted whiplash rock scene which centered on live music venue The Magic Stick, which nurtured local bands including the White Stripes and the Von Bondies. However, despite the undeniable excellence and innovation of the Detroit music scene since the 1980s, the city has continued to struggle with the legacy of a marked downturn in the area's key 20th century industry, automobile production, and the attendant side effects of depopulation and post-industrial decline. Between 2000 and 2010, Detroit's population fell by 25%, changing its ranking from America's 10th largest city to 18th. Following an extended period of white flight back to the suburbs, by 2015, Detroit had an 85% Black population, making it the most Black city in America. In 2015, at least 70,000 homes, or 20% of Detroit's housing stock, were considered to be abandoned or damaged beyond reasonable repair. Many of the homes were abandoned in the years that followed the 2008 financial crisis, when many Detroit residents, unable to keep up their mortgage repayments, were forced from their homes. Shocking images began appearing of the once grand and now devastated city. Perhaps the epitome of Detroit ruin porn being the abandoned Michigan Central Station at 2405 West Werner Highway, a vast and still grand Beaux-Arts rail terminal owned by the Muron family, who for decades left it open to vandals, scrappers, and the elements. But in 2018, this ruined building was bought by the Ford Motor Company, who planned to turn it into a learning hub. When I visited Detroit, I interviewed Greg Bays, who was then the curator of public programs at the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, located in a former auto dealership on Woodward Avenue. Asked what he considered to be the most significant changes that had taken place in Detroit in the last 20 years, Bays replied, "I'd say more attention. People pay more attention. People coming into the city for cultural events, more people moving to the city. There are people who move here and they get it and they understand and they fit in and they're doing something that's appreciated. But there are also people that are exploitative or ignorant, like they don't really get what's going on around here. A lot of people think, oh yeah, I'm going to move to Detroit and buy a $500 home and everything. It's like paradise and it's a blank slate and all this stuff. It's like there's all these triggers and warning signs. They really need to slow down. You need to visit, you need to talk to the people. Talk to people who don't have the same color skin as you. You know, all this stuff is really important and is something that gets lost." In July 2013, the decline of Detroit's economic strength was confirmed when the city filed for the largest Chapter 9 municipal bankruptcy in American history. That month, Detroit's state-appointed emergency manager, Kevin D. Orr, told the press that everything is on the table when asked if the city-owned Detroit Institute of the Arts collection, which included works by Van Gogh, Diego Rivera, Caravaggio, Bruegel, Rembrandt, Rodin, and Picasso, could be sold to pay off creditors. Following public outcry, the collection was kept intact. Since 2013, the Midtown area of the city has continued to develop as a cultural hub, thanks to the work of institutions including the DEA, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Detroit Public Library, Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and the Detroit Historical Museum, the Center for Creative Studies, and Wayne State University. Prior to the declaration of the bankruptcy of Detroit, the extent of the city's economic problems had been mired in secrecy. So 2013 ushered in a new era of openness and accountability, the appointment of new leadership and legal repercussions for those who were guilty of corrupt practices. In 2007, more than half of Detroit's residents had found themselves living in a food desert where access to a grocery store was severely curtailed. But as Kevin Ware documents in his book DIY, The Search for Control and Self-Reliance in the 21st Century, amid this social tragedy, guerrilla gardeners began farming empty lots, creating gardens and feeding fellow residents. Community groups and ad hoc collections of neighbours developed more than 1,000 small farms and community gardens. Today, many Detroit streets and neighbourhoods show evidence of careful tending of small plots by residents and non-profit organisations like the Greening of Detroit, which started 30 years ago with one part-time volunteer, and now has 30 full-time staff members. There are now at least 1,400 farms and community gardens in Detroit, including D-Town Farm, started by Malik Yakini in 2006 on a quarter-acre of land, which is now spread to cover 7 acres in the city's Rouge Park. Yakini's motto is, "We cannot free ourselves until we feed ourselves." Detroit-based activist and author Grace Lee Boggs was also a vocal and articulate petitioner of what she calls bottom-up change, the need to see Detroit's problem as an opportunity. She wrote, "The thousands of vacant lots and abandoned homes provide not only the space to begin anew, but also the incentive to create innovative ways of making our living, ways that nurture our productive, cooperative, and caring selves." Another notable example of community arts activism is Mike Kelly's mobile homestead, a replica of the artist's childhood home in the Detroit suburb of Westland, which was installed at the city's Museum of Contemporary Art just before the artist took his own life in 2012. Kelly had hoped that the homestead could be used as an alternate community centre, and this hope was subsequently realised as city services were cut back during the bankruptcy. Mobile Homestead became, for example, a default public library, and other regular activities that have taken place in the Mobile Homestead have included a monthly quilting workshop and a weekly Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Detroit-based artist and gallerist Simone de Souza told me, "I think the tension is what creatives in general are attracted to. The possibility and the idea of discovery. You realise something that nobody's paying attention to. You see that it carries amazing potential, that there's something there." Asked about the growing significance of community gardens in Detroit, de Souza agreed this had been an important part of residents reimagining their city. "Absolutely. I think there's a very fundamental idea of connection, being connected with your environment. I'm not just talking about plants, but also other people and the streets around you. I think when things are really bad, people isolate themselves even more. Your environment becomes your enemy. In a sense, you're protecting yourself. You quickly walk from one point to another and hide inside a building. And now with our hands being in the garden, what we're doing is truly acting on how our environment is being shaped, and it's a thing of pride." As part of my research into Detroit, I interviewed artist, curator, educator, and writer Cedric Ty, who was born in Detroit in 1985 and grew up in Northville, Michigan. I asked him, "You've lived through some of the most turbulent times in the city's history. Do you think Detroit is a good place for artists to live and work? What would you describe as the most interesting and the most challenging aspects of the local situation?" He said, "The first place that I lived in Detroit was in a loft on the riverfront run by property developers Boydell Development. At some point, a really loud barbershop would play music till 3 a.m, and I might have to wake up early for student teaching in the suburbs. And when I'd get back, I would finish a painting on the floor of my bedroom. It was probably closer to being an art studio than an actual room, since there was no ceiling to our divided spaces. In my circle, there was a belief that there were no safe investments outside of each other. In our concept of our neighbourhood or our art scene, we were well aware in my generation we wouldn't make as much money as our parents, but that wasn't a big deal because student loan debt, healthcare bills, and general inequality had fully disillusioned our generation from chasing the American dream. It seemed like everything we learned in school was about needing to fix the ongoing problems, and at least living in Detroit, one felt like one was much less deluded from the real problems at hand, that one could make a difference when aware of one's privilege and make major life decisions, such as not making a ton of money, that may be tougher but would be more meaningful. Obviously, the biggest change since 2008 was the gigantic spotlight on the city that made most people self-conscious, and at least 2 large non-profit foundations, Kresge and the Knight Foundation, attempted to fill the void of there being non-existent public funding for art. The problem I see in how these foundations have all operated is they still, in subtle ways, request artists to account for the community. I believe the Kresge asks in their application about the artist's relationship to a community, but one of the qualities of some Detroit-based artists is that they are hermits. Maybe hermits are getting clever and hiring grant writers. It seems like there's a lot of social practice going on, but I feel like this is the largest thing that we as artists need to be skeptical of, and I try and bring up this perspective as often as I can. As Larna Absig-Gogarty observed in Art and Gentrification on the uses and abuses of social practice, we need to recognise that the further retrenchment of state provision and deepening recession since 2008 have pushed frequently well-meaning, socially engaged artists towards plugging the gap in providing social services where they risk endorsing the logic of austerity. I asked Cedric, do you think that the experience of space in Detroit influences the local art scene? Can you say how? I'm thinking about the idea of the perforated city, implemented partly by accident, partly by design, which allows the emergence of green spaces, community gardens, open spaces, gap sites, ruined, derelict historic buildings, some of which can be repurposed as studio spaces. He replied, what those spaces have in common is that each was an unclaimed parcel where you could secure your stuff or transform, but it wasn't so much a bubble or a fortress with tall razor wire. In some ways, I feel like those places themselves were perforated with a sense that no matter where you rented, something felt temporary because you just couldn't say when something big was going to change everything. I'm sure that one of the biggest appeals of raves and warehouses, restaurants out at someone's home, or an event like Theatre Bazaar that's set up in the empty and wide open space of the State Fair grounds, or a crowded street during the 4th Street Fair, was the sheer transformation that needed to be propped up on as fragile a platform as the illicit party. I can't imagine these things being more official, where someone has to come in afterwards to clean up. And it's more likely in Detroit you would run into or talk with someone who actually lives down the block of wherever that event was happening, no matter how remote. Maybe they work there or volunteer there. That seems special too. Maybe you were in a place that felt like a field in the middle of nowhere, but you would still be someone's guest. It's just that the walls were more of an imaginary boundary and hundreds of feet away. I'm just going to finish by talking about East Anglia, where I live now. As I mentioned at the outset, these last few years I've been based in East Anglia. So I wanted to finish by making some observations about what we might call the neo-pastoral aspects of this region. The use of the land in East Anglia has been a contentious one for many generations, as far back as the 16th century, when at this oak tree in Heatherset in 1549, Robert and William Kett of Windham assembled their men before marching on Norwich to air their grievances concerning the enclosure of the common lands and the rising cost of living. Various enclosure hedges were thrown down by their respective followers as Kett's rebellion got underway. The 19th century saw the outbreak of the swing riots across the region, when the harsh winter of 1830 followed a poor harvest and caused reduced wages for labourers. Agricultural riots spread across Norfolk and throughout the south and east of England. The labourers wanted to stop the spread of new threshing machines, which they viewed as a threat to one of their few winter employments. They targeted rich farmers, magistrates, and clergymen who received tithes, 1/10 of annual produce or labour given to the church. Threatening letters were sent, signed by a mysterious leader, Captain Swing, demanding wage rises, reduced tithes, or destruction of threshing machines. The swing riots did not succeed in halting the very gradual but seismic shift from small-scale farming to agribusiness that began with the General Enclosure Act of 1801 in 1836 and was then accelerated by mechanisation. Today, the biggest industry in Norfolk is construction, followed by scientific and technical occupations, then agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And the region could be described as neo-pastoral, in that while farming is still a key part of life in the region, other occupations linked to culture and heritage have expanded, including tourism and creative industries. A faster rail connection to London has also meant an increase in commuters based in Norwich, and there's been a marked rise in second home owners in the region. As Raymond Williams succinctly noted, remote rural areas, which are often losing their populations and livelihoods become the dream places of urban escape. I was very drawn to East Anglia because of the way in which the past and present interlink in the region's religious and secular, political and social landscape. Before the Industrial Revolution, the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex had at various times been the scene of important industrial and commercial activity. Norwich, as the centre of a great worsted industry, made its influence felt over much of Norfolk and was the third city in the kingdom, second only to London and Bristol, right up to the era of industrialisation. As D.C. Coleman wrote, along with the textile complex with its ramifications of combing, spinning, weaving, dyeing and finishing, employing many thousands all over the countryside, went sundry other commercial and industrial activities, trade in grain, butter, cloth, timber and fish, and from such ports as King's Lynn, Yarmouth, Woodbridge, Ipswich, Colchester. Shipbuilding was stimulated by an active coastal trade, malting and brewing by acres of barley and a ready thirst for beer. The whole area was seemingly in the forefront of advance, prosperous in agriculture as an industry, accepting from the countries across the North Sea new ideas in farming as well as new men and new fabrics and textiles. But the total absence of coal and iron in Norfolk, added to an already inadequate water power, poor inland communications, and geographical remoteness from the new centres of technological and economic change, like the big industrial cities of London and Manchester, meant that the region's growth stalled in the early 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, expenditure on poor relief was higher in agricultural than in manufacturing areas. Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk, with their decaying and inadequate industries, had rates which were well above the national average and far exceeded those in the counties experiencing industrial growth. Norwich kept its medieval street plan, stayed small but intense. There's a saying that Norwich had a church for every week of the year and a pub for every day of the week. Today, both the sacred history of Norwich as a site of pilgrimage and the city's ongoing history as an important marketplace continue to shape the city's creative scene. Norwich remains a place where the values of the countryside meet those of the city, and likewise where conservative and progressive political agendas must be reconciled. I've mentioned already the self-reliant, localised economies of the small towns and villages surrounding Norwich. But worth a mention too are all the self-made local entertainments like amateur dramatics, pop-up cinemas, mazes, folk art museums, music festivals, craft circles, cricket and football matches, clay pigeon shoots, tug-of-wars and village fetes. Such activities are open access and rooted in amateurism. Consequently, they're truly democratic and attract a wide range of ages and abilities. Coastal towns like Cromer and Yarmouth also have important free public activities and traditions rooted in their beaches and piers, like the Boxing Day dip at Cromer and the Easter tradition of throwing the cross off Great Yarmouth Pier, with locals swimming for the cross to see who can get it first. The seaside towns of East Anglia have weathered the decline of historic trades, such as Great Yarmouth's herring trade, followed by the rise of overseas package holidays, leading to a marked downturn in these towns' seasonal hotel and restaurant trades. Yet the spaces left behind by this gradual decline have also created possibilities. The encroachment of speculative property acquisition in East Anglia has certainly been slower than in other places a bit closer to London, such as Brighton and Margate. Interesting examples of meanwhile use of empty commercial properties in the region include the Lower Green Gallery set up on the ground floor of Anglia Square Shopping Centre by artist organisers Henry Jackson Newcomb, who's our host tonight, and Jonathan P. Watts to host exhibition, talks and events in a time-limited programme that ran between July 2018 and March 2019. In Great Yarmouth, original projects run by Caboose Clayton and Julia Devonshire previously set up a gallery in the town's former Marks and Spencer shop and are now delivering a programme of exhibitions and events from the town's former Debenhams in a space they've called Prime Yard. One of their numerous current projects includes hosting a community design studio to provide space and support for disadvantaged young people to create design solutions to everyday problems. Creative projects are rooted in finite temporality. So even when empty lots are claimed and invested in by the local community, they still matter, even when the land is constantly at risk of being grabbed back. As Saskia Sassen points out, making by the powerless has a far slower temporality than that of making by the powerful, who can grab and destroy quickly. Yet when the demands of outsiders for expanded inclusion succeed, they strengthen the overall institution of citizenship. They may not have gained much power in this process, but their powerlessness became complex and they made a history of politics. I agree wholeheartedly with the views of Detroit-based activist Grace Lee Boggs that we need to reassess our priorities and then act to become the leaders we are looking for. Boggs insists that the capitalist model is irreparably broken and that the future lies in self-directed community action. She writes, what actually holds the very fabric of our society together are local activities that are not done for money, household activities such as raising children and cooking, barter activities like trading services with friends and neighbours, and cooperative enterprises based on common ownership and control. These mutual care and cooperative activities are the seeds of another economy. While sometimes such activities are engaged in out of necessity in order to save money, that doesn't alter the fact that the alternate economies inherent in cooperative behaviour hold the potential to safeguard our society. The philosopher and polemical critic Ivan Illich observed in his highly prescient book, Tools for Conviviality, periodic innovations in goods or tools foster the belief that anything new will be proven better. This belief has become an integral part of the modern worldview. The better replaces the good as the fundamental normative concept. However, today there is noticeable resistance to the inbuilt obsolescence that characterizes modern consumer culture, combined with the continuance of such allegedly outmoded practices as making your own clothes and growing your own food. The renewal of interest in the homestead model in the post-industrial period is part of this contemporary reassessment of the value and satisfaction that is implicit in producing rather than in simply consuming. As Illich astutely notes, man's need for language and law, for memory and myths, imposes limits to the change of tools. People continue to chop their own firewood, make their own preserves, and knit their own jumpers, not only to save money, but to connect with preceding traditions of human activity. As Peter Korn asks in Why We Make Things and Why It Matters, why do we choose the spiritually, emotionally, and physically demanding work of bringing new objects into the world with creativity and skill? His answer is, the material of the world does not bend easily, yet it is work that exercises creative muscle, work through which I construct my identity and map the world in a way that fulfills me and finds confirmation from others. The emphasis on self-actualization through doing is central, not only because of the evident personal satisfaction such practices bring, but also because such approaches can secure a happier future for entire communities. What I'm proposing is that peripheral places like Leipzig, Hastings, Detroit, and East Anglia might offer a combination of city aspects, modern, enlightened, illuminated, and country aspects, simplicity, peace, the old values, as it's often put. People who make their lives in such places might miss out on the crowd's noise, luxury, pride, and power associated with major cities, but in its place they might retrieve something valuable that has almost disappeared. A way of living and working which is not wholly commercial and is motivated by a combination of entrepreneurial, innovative, and altruistic ambitions. That's the end. Thank you for listening. Yeah, it's not like that now since it's been bought over. So now
So
it
now it
has
has
things
things
on
on
it.
it.
So
So
it
it
has
has
an
an
amusement
amusement
arcade
arcade
and
and
fiberglass
fiberglass
animals and
animals
things
and
on
things
it.
on it.
Oh, sorry, I've just
Definitely.
realised that you could hear me then, but my mic was off to everyone else. So I was just asking about Hastings audio, Hastings audio, Hastings Pier. Yeah. So okay, yeah. Sorry, you were just saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
just
It's
saying,
not
it's not
unfortunately
unfortunately
it's
it's
not
not
empty
empty
anymore.
anymore.
I
I
thought
thought
it
it
was
was
amazing
amazing
that
that
it was
it was
set up
set up
like
like
that, so it
that,
was
so it was
empty and
empty
it
and
was a
it was a
flexible
flexible
space.
space.
But
But
then
then,
kind of sadly, because the charity set up to run it got into financial difficulties, that meant they was bought over, and now it's a little bit more like a conventional pier, which I think there's been some problems around that. Yeah, but I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that when you're talking about a seaside town, it's like 180-degree civilization, and then the rest is the beach and the sea. So the beach and the sea are really important, I think, to people that live in those places, as we know locally in Yarmouth and Cromer. Those places are very important. So I think in Hastings, the pier became a real focus of people's emotions, because of the fact that it's gone through so much with the fires and the reconstructions.
Mm. Yeah. Sorry, I think it's caught up now. For a second there, your voice was doubling for everyone. I realised, but and then Johnny's told me as well. But it was just before I put my headphones on. But it was fine the whole way through. It was just at the end. So don't worry, Sarah. The other thing I wanted to say before, firstly, is if anyone has any questions, do post them to the chat on YouTube, and we'll discuss them. I just wanted to say to Sarah kind of how lovely it was to see this kind of looking at different cities and places in a time when we're so fixed. That makes it ever so more special and kind of I don't know. It's in yeah, I don't know. It's just very nice to see and learn about places after feeling so kind of contained in our own, despite being in a peripheral place. I don't know. I don't have a question for that. I just thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, I felt the same. I felt nostalgic, going back over my photos and observations of visiting those places, because all three, although very different, just such fascinating, amazing places. And I think probably everybody at the moment longs to be able to travel again. So yeah, I'm glad you felt that way, Henry. I liked looking back at the places again too.
Jonathan's said in the chat, Leipzig and Detroit characterised by depopulation. We tend not to think of the UK towns losing population, but we do think of empty spaces, retail. That's not a statement.
Yeah, I mean, Glasgow, obviously, I moved there in 1993, and the population was declining at that time. Glasgow now has kind of regained quite a lot of the population that it used to have, a couple of generations ago. And it is interesting. I think it does that does impact on how people feel when they're living in the place. You get a sense of whether a town or a city is sort of on the up, or whether people are, in the case of Detroit, obviously the white flight was a significant issue. And I also found it very poignant and what Killian Shelbeck said about how some of his friends left Leipzig, and he was one of the families that stayed. And that strange for us to think now, that idea that people would leave, and he genuinely thought he might not see them again. Obviously, it all kind of changed in 1989, but at that time, that was a real feeling that people had of being left behind.
When I was reading that out, I realised I hadn't read Jonathan's bit further down that you might have seen on screen, Sarah. I don't know. Just saying, does depopulation happen in the UK? He repeated the comment, but with a question underneath that I hadn't seen. So,
Yeah.
And then also from Nell saying, can these places be manufactured or do they happen organically? reading that out, I realised I hadn't read Jonathan's bit further down. You might have seen on screen, Sarah.
Can they be manufactured? I'm not sure, actually. It's kind of hard to say, because I think that's why I find this idea about the perforated city quite interesting, that it wasn't really a plan to develop Leipzig in that way. It was partly by accident and partly by design, as said. And to some extent, these things happen because there isn't a will to try and manufacture it. It kind of happens because nobody's looking. You know, that sort of creates a kind of sense of possibility. I mean, obviously, I talked about quite a lot of examples of buildings and things that were, you know, due to be demolished, and somebody requisitioned them and took them over. I think it's to some extent you kind of need a situation like that where there's not that much pressure on it, because that gives more scope for activity. So, yeah.
And you mentioned Margate briefly. I know a bit about what happened there with the building, but is that relevant to the discussion of forming places, manufacturing places?
Well, I suppose it's kind of, I find it's interesting just purely in terms of the thing about, I think it's really important that people are able to go into places for free. And I think that in Margate, obviously Turner Contemporaries made a big impact on the situation there, because people feel they can go into the building and use it. And it's the same with the De La Warr Pavilion, it's free. The whole issue around the Jerwood Gallery, now Hastings Contemporary, is that you have to pay to go in. And I think when people have to pay to go in, and there's a lot of people that are very hard up in that area, that does create an antagonism, because it feels like, okay, that's not for us. And that's kind of, in a sense, like I picked Hastings partly for that reason, because I think it's quite important not to talk about these places as being like opportunities for creatives, inverted commas, that can move there, but also to think about what's the opportunity for the people that live there already. And that's kind of why I found the pier was kind of exciting as a space, because you thought, this is amazing that it's really open for everybody there and it's free for them to go there and so on. And why it seemed kind of a bit poignant that now that's been kind of privatized. So I think that's a kind of something that really interests me, is this kind of idea about how do people access culture, and you know, art and culture, you know, how does it become available for everybody, not just be something that's kind of, you know, happens in a particular way and you have to pay for it.
Yeah, and really, really nice. Of course, seeing those pictures back of Lower Green, and the time, like our time there, and being the only space in the square that people could come into without needing to spend money, kind of thing. It was very much the open doors, but kind of a welcoming space without a cost. It definitely made some different conversations about the local area and community that we wouldn't have had, I don't think, had we been.
Yeah. And you found that you like met lots of different people that were coming there, didn't you? Just purely like the location helped, didn't it? That people were kind of passing through, and because you made it welcome, people felt involved and that they could come in.
Yeah, it often took people like several goes of coming to the door before they came in, or like people's children would come in, and like the parents would be like, oh, like I'm not sure, and then would like, you're welcome to come in, you don't have to like it, you can like say what you think. And I think it was very much the thing of being open and welcoming and getting people to try and talk about it, whatever their view was. I think really helped us in that situation to understand that local community. Louise is saying there seems to be many more empty spaces with the pandemic. It makes me wonder what it will look like in 6 months in retail areas. Yeah.
That's true. I mean, I think that it had been quite interesting in Norwich, in the Castle Quarter, that they've done these things with the lending library and ping pong tables and a room where you can play the piano, and obviously all of that's kind of off limits now, but that did seem like quite an interesting use of the space to just make it a place where you can just spend time, but you don't have to spend money. And I think that that is something that's really interesting, and I hope that there'll be more things like that will happen, because of course it is the case that so much shopping is moving online now, but I think that people really need to see other people and be seen by them and be in kind of shared kind of communal spaces. I think that's a kind of really human need. I think that's one thing that the pandemic has kind of shown us all, is just how much we need to be around others. And so that's, I think that's a really kind of key aspect, is looking at how can that be supported, especially now, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, very, very, very true. I think those words ring true with most people at the present time, especially how everyone's feeling. Katie Nicole saying, agreeing with Louise above, I think there'll be a glut of commercial spaces, but it's whether the councils will see potential with empty space provision. Interesting from Melanie Holly saying, interesting to think of the role and responsibility of artists and community arts in peripheral places or areas of high indexes of deprivation.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I've noticed recently I thought was interesting was a report that the Fabian Society had put together that was saying that of Arts Council England funding, everyone knows this already, but the weighting is disproportionate to London, so twice as much goes to London than to other areas, and essentially calling for the devolution of that funding so that it's given to local councils and local community leaders who can use that money effectively, because of course that's always the question, is like, how do you pay for this? And also I think, you know, it's interesting, this kind of what Cedric Tighe said, this kind of idea about, is it, obviously I'm very interested in community and participatory arts, but I kind of, it resonated with me a bit, this thing about saying it shouldn't be down to artists also to address shortcomings in society that are the fault of government as well. So that's, you know, it really kind of, this kind of idea about how in Hastings there'd be families that be struggling just to get like very basic things. You've got to kind of sort the basic things first, of course, but over and above that, I do think there's an argument to be made for more funding coming to the so-called peripheries, for sure. Because it is a weird contradiction that there's so many museums that are free to go to in London, and yet where we are now in East Anglia, that you have to pay to go into quite a lot of the museums.
Or pay to go to London.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kavus saying, thanks Sarah, really fascinating thoughts and comparisons to reflect on. Do you think there's something about scale or critical mass that changes a place from having a city feel to a village feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly to do with population. As I said at the start, this kind of idea of being a kind of mid-sized metro, so less than 1 million people, I think is probably most conducive, you know, for a kind of that kind of feel. But also population density is really important as well, and I think that that's one of the things about Detroit and Leipzig, is that even though they're relatively kind of big places, the population density is low, so you feel like you have kind of quite a lot of space and kind of freedom. Hastings is a bit different from that, which is just partly down to, as I said, the thing with it being the kind of 180 degrees thing, so you're kind of you have this more compressed, actually Hastings population density is higher than either Leipzig or Detroit, and that obviously would be the case, you know, if we're thinking about places like Yarmouth and Norwich as well, that have kept a kind of medieval centre, and you still have that kind of sense of the small streets and things like that. So I think it's, you can experience feelings of community in different ways, but I think that the way that it seems to work in Leipzig and Detroit is that you have pockets of kind of activity that are gathered together around kind of certain hubs like the Spinnerei, for example, or Coney Island in Leipzig, and the same in Detroit. So this sort of area that I spoke about, the Gratoy Avenue and the sort of midtown area, that's a kind of walkable district, and lots of people would spend time there going to, coffee shops or whatever it might be. So I think that maybe you have sense more of a village within a wider area in Leipzig and Detroit, whereas maybe in the smaller places like Hastings or Yarmouth or Norwich, it's like the village is just in one place, like around the market square, perhaps. It's a bit of a rambling answer.
As someone else said, half our audience are fish.
Yeah.
Lovely. I was also going to, well, I mean, not from the comments, but I'd also written down to look up the Winkleman more, who I hadn't heard of.
Yeah, I mean, I just find that was kind of interesting because I think that this idea about the sort of altruism is really interesting. It's like, I mean, obviously, people have to kind of earn a living and people want to innovate and be entrepreneurial as well. But I think in all of the examples I talked about, there's this strong kind of altruistic aspect to the situation. So in Hastings, it was really obvious that there were, like with the old Hastings Preservation Society, basically more or less like saved most of the interesting buildings in the town, and then this Winkle Club has been going since 1900, and it still like plays an important part in the town of being this kind of charitable organisation that kind of takes care for people that are deprived or in need of help. So I think that's a kind of really key thing as well, is that kind of emphasis on helping one another and sort of charitable acts is kind of, I think that's part of a kind of healthy community situation.
Yeah, and even how how despite how things might have started, like the idea of supporting the organisations that support community that carry on over such a long time by often like alleviating some of the don't know, that mumbled off. Didn't know my words. Winkles up. I feel like, do you high five when you say that, or what's the?
I don't know.
You can't. It says you just say winkle up, but I feel like it. Or well, Johnny's saying winkles up in the chat, so I'm sure that'll be a regular Norwich occurrence before long. I'm going to round up there, unless anyone else has anything else to say, because I feel like otherwise I might say something silly. But thank you, Sarah, for that lovely talk. And
thank you for inviting me again. And it's a great pleasure. And this is a good way to sort of connect with other people. And thank you very much, everyone who tuned in to watch, listen, and posted questions as well. I really appreciate that a lot. So thank you very much.
And do you want to say about the book that's coming out?
Oh yeah, right. Okay. So yes. Okay. So yeah. So the material that I've just been reading, that's the kind of concluding section of this book that was published in 2018. It was called Contemporary Artists Working Outside the City: Creative Retreat, and previously in Assembly Online, I've talked about the other parts of the book, which were about Agnes Martin, Derek Jarman, and Chris Burden. So the material tonight is the concluding section of the book, and it's coming out in a paperback edition on March the 31st, which is great because previously it was just published in a hardback edition by Routledge, which is you can only really find in libraries because it's rather too much expensive for people to buy ordinarily. So I'm quite happy that this book will be coming out in a more affordable edition soon. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really positive after hearing all the parts of it to then to hear of the printing as paperback. I think it's really good.
Yeah.
Jules just saying, thanks Sarah, great talk, chat as ever. Just reached a keyboard. Big fan of the subject matter. And lots of thank yous. I was just going to round up by saying what we've got coming up next week. We've got Oven By with Jonathan P. Watts. Oven By is a series of talks, screenings and discussions. His guest for next week is Robert Gluck. Not next week, in 2 weeks, on the 4th of Feb. The poet, fiction writer, and editor Robert Gluck served as editor of the San Francisco State University's The Poetry Center, co-director of the Small Press Traffic Literary Center and associate editor of Lapis Press. He is the author of 12 books, including in 2 weeks, on the 4th of Feb. Sorry. The poet. Sorry, I could just hear your audio. He's the author of 12 books, including 2 novels, Marguerite Kemp and Jacques the Modernist, communal nude collected essays. In 2020, Marguerite Kemp was republished by New York Review of Books Classics. Also, sorry, my the text is reformatted, so I'm trying to read it as it's like a concrete poem. I won't read it all now. I don't know why I started reading it, but that's what's coming up in 2 weeks' time for Oven By with Jonathan P. Watts. And then on the 18th of Feb, it's an international poetry reading. I meant to just read the title, but anyway, thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. And Nell says, wonderful, thank you. Hopefully see you all in 2 weeks. I'll post the link to the mailing list in the chat now. If you're not on the mailing list already, then that's a good way of finding out about the upcoming events. Hope you're all okay and stay well and safe, and look after each other and look out for people. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.